So good afternoon, everyone. We are here at this session called Human Trafficking and the Sex Industry, and we have two very interesting presentations. We'll start with the presentations. What Ayelet said in Hebrew, we'll start with the presentations, 22 minutes for each presentation, and then we'll open the session for questions and discussions. Meanwhile, you can use the chat in order to write any comments or questions that you have. Me and the presenters will look at the chat and see the questions, and then we'll discuss everything together. If you would like to write in Hebrew, it's also available, and then we'll translate it into English. So we'll start with Nour and Diana. Dr. Nour Shimei, from a fellow of Haruv Institute Research at the School of Criminology, University of Leicester, and Diana Blaj, Migrant Outreach Coordinator in the organization POW from Nottingham in the UK. They are both in the UK now. And they will present talking about, they think we are all trafficked Romanian migrant sex workers in the UK. So, Nour and Diana, the floor is yours.
Yes, okay. Hi, everybody. I told Diana that I'm very excited to be here, and I have a lot of reason to be excited. And I told her that for me, it's kind of a summary of our work together during the last few months. And I'm really excited because Israel is home for me, and I think you also know this feeling of being here and being there. Like, where is your home? Where is your birth home? And during the last few months, I've been doing a research in POW. That's when I met Diana. And as a researcher and a volunteer in NGO, I've done a couple of things. And one of the things was to give my knowledge kind of to the organization. And I mean that the organization asked me if I can help the staff, and Diana was among them, to do research or to think how to think about the role and the things that they do from research and especially qualitative perspective. And I don't know if you remember, but on my first day in POW, you and Karis took me inside a room and sat me on a chair and said, okay, now listen about the research Diana is doing, and we want you to work with her. So, and today we're going to speak about that. And more thing that I've done in the organization was to be a volunteer one day a week, especially in the drop-in. And in between, I was doing my research work. And I have to say that building this relationship with the staff, with the women, getting to know them, getting to know me, was part of me getting inside the research field and doing my research. So I think that's me. Diana?
Hello, my name is Diana. I am originally from Romania, and I have moved in the UK 12 years ago. But I am a teacher, but actually I have joined this organization. I never thought I'm going to work with this kind of people. But the moment I stepped into POW and I was offered the job, I was very, very happy, and I was very pleased that I could support people that I knew they are not going to access any support. So POW, what is POW actually? It's an organization that supports sex workers and those affected by sex work. They had a lot of clients accessing the drop-in and the services, but not the migrants. Even they were absolutely sure that there were a lot of migrant sex workers in the city, but they would never engage with this organization. So they employed me, first of all, because I speak different languages, and because they thought in this way it's going to be easier to build the trust and to make the women engage. But secondly, it was about understanding their culture and being able to make the difference between trafficked women or people they just made educated choices. So this is how I started at PAO. Then I became a bit, when I started working with these ladies, I became a bit frustrated and upset because I have seen they are not treated fairly, and it was a lot of stigma and discrimination involved. So then I decided, and I was very interested to see what was their journey to the UK. But again, I was very frustrated because they were really treated badly. I mean, the stigma was attached all the time. They were not seen like workers. And it was a double stigma there. First of all, they were migrants, and secondly, they were sex workers. And on top of everything, I had clients from a Roma background. So that was the third stigma attached.
But for people that doesn't understand what it means to be from a Roma background and from Romanian migrants in the UK and in Europe, can you say something more about that? Because it's different than other migrants.
Yes, okay. So Roma, I don't know if you know, Roma community is all over Europe. So they are not Romanian, they are not Czech, they are not Slovakian or Polish or whatever. They are Roma. People could not make the difference between Romanians and Roma, but it was very rarely that somebody from Roma community, which they have their own rules, very strict rules, would be found working in sex work. So that was, and Roma people are considered gypsies, lower class, and they are stigmatized and stereotyped all the time. So that was a thing that upset me a lot. And of course, I was a bit shocked seeing people from a Roma background working as sex worker, because again, I was in the same situation. I didn't know that things evolve, and at some point it doesn't matter, but the stigma was there, and I said 3 layers of stigma, which was really upsetting.
Mm-hmm. And it's also, I remember when you told me in the beginning that it also was something that surprised that everybody sees it as trafficking and not as sex work. Can you say something?
Yes, this was something that upset me, because I was part of some trainings or conferences, and yeah, all the migrant sex workers are trafficked, which was not the case at all. As I said, most of them made educated decisions. They knew they are coming to the UK to work as sex workers. They had a person who informed them, look, you can go there and make some good money, and life in London is very nice. And so they knew. It was only one case that disclosed in the end that they were trafficked. So no way, like the statistics say, that I don't know how many, a huge percentage of the migrant sex workers are trafficked is not the case at all.
Mm-hmm. So the last couple of months, what we have done, we have been working together, analyzing interviews that you, Diana, have done with 14 women that you've known from your work in PAO. And when I met Diana, so she wanted to do something with those interviews. And then we started to look at the interviews. In the beginning, I think there were like a lot of ideas what to do with all this data, but there was something that comes up all the time. You said something about it. I remember you said something about the journey, and then we understand that maybe we can challenge this idea between, or not idea, but this dichotomy between coming to work in sex work and being trafficked. And we then thought, let's look on this journey that the woman telling us about and what's happening in this journey. Maybe we don't see it as right. Maybe there is something else. So let's look from the way first from before they are coming to the UK. And then we discovered that it's not only coming from Romania, it's also some of them have worked in sex working in other European countries. And then we understand that the motivation of coming to the UK were very diverse.
Yes, so I was thinking that now is the time to listen to these women and the stories to be part of real, straight from their mouth and not from the books and not from somebody who heard about. And I thought this is the right moment to establish how this journey happened and exactly what Nour said, what motivations were behind, and we were really surprised to notice things that we would not believe before, but this was coming straight from their mouth. We knew that it's accurate. It's not third party hearing or hearsay or something. So sex working in Romania is treated was treated differently than in the UK. So stigma was their judgment. Everybody was very judgmental. This topic was a taboo. Nobody would talk about it. Police were harsh on them. Fines were given. Fine after fine after fine. They were not capable to pay. They ended up in court. It was all that stigma that the families found out about what these women are doing because of the letters they received at home from the police. They had no chance to be employed. They had no chance to go to school. So it was really bad. I have to say honestly that things are moving forward now because I have seen the first big organization in Romania that supports sex workers and is a big advocate for sex workers' rights, and that makes me really happy. But in the UK, things are different. Things were different when I started. That's why this is what I want to highlight. Even though they were not really understood and it's still stigma attached, but these organizations are all over the countries. That the organization they support sex workers. Actually, POW is the only organization in the country that has got a special person like me dealing with only migrants and speaking the language, which was a bonus because this is how I built the trust. So then when we started looking at this journey, it was everybody was coming first in the capital, in London, because everybody wants to see London.
And maybe it's important to say that one of the findings was that a lot of the women came to the UK because of the positive stigma that they heard about working in sex working in the UK, about that the police is more understandable,
yes,
and it's possible to work here in sex work. So it's not only not only those things that they didn't have, but also what England had to offer them. So,
yes, it's true. Yeah, that was another reason they came over, because they heard police is better. They can find places to work. They do not need to declare their income. Of course, police is different now. It's all about safeguarding. They check the houses, but they say it's about safeguarding. We do not prosecute. POW is it's going after decriminalization. That's the approach. So it's decriminalization. We don't do the Nordic model approach. So it was, they thought it's something good in here. And I'm telling you honestly, each one of them had a target. They said, when I stop working, I need to have a house for my mom, to fix the roof, my child in school, have a house back in Romania. My parents being sorted, I mean, health-wise, because they needed money. So they had like a booklet with like an accountant. They would write down every day how much money they made, and then how much they spent, how much they sent home. Yes, the journey looked like, in the end, I think that it was an educated choice. So they knew.
And yeah, and also I think for me it was this notion of how they use other people, like friends, family, people that work here, some other friends that work here, to organize their coming, that it will be very safe.
Yes.
And I know a lot, like in the literature, there's like something that's saying that those people who help them always doing it that they will get something. They are trying to manipulate them, that they will traffic them. But it's looked like from the journeys that they reached to those people, and they did it because they felt more safe to come to a new country that some of them did not know the language, do not know the rules. They come alone.
Yes, and yeah, it's true. To be honest, first time when I came across a sex worker, and I tried to contact her via an informal text message saying, "I'm here to help you." She said, "I need to see you. I need to see you on WhatsApp. I need to see you are a real person and not someone who wants to attract me or to wants to in very obscure places and things. So I need to." And the second thing was, how much do I need to pay for this help? They could not understand that this is offered for free. They thought it's something behind. We want something in return. So that was their first vision of what POW means. But then I was seen as a trafficker by a organization, an agency, because I was accompanying a lot of women from my clients. I was going with them to translate for them and to arrange meetings, and they thought I'm a trafficker. They did not even check that I am coming from an organization. I have a badge with my name on it, with the name of the organization. They said I'm a trafficker because I brought too many women to their service. So this gave me so much frustration, and that's why I said we need to work on this and do some findings and put this work out there for people to understand.
Diana, we have like, I think 2 minutes. Yeah, Guy? We have like, okay, so
you
let's
do the rest.
Okay.
The findings.
No, I think in 2 minutes we only gonna say that in these days we are working together with Daisy, and she's a PhD student, and we are all working together on finishing the article. And I want to say that for me, the way you address the finding regard their coming to Nottingham and this idea of community, I think it's beautiful. It was very exciting I didn't saw it, and I think your perspective on it was very important. And when you show us that once they got here, they were alone, and by meeting you, creating kind of a help network, and a little bit creating of new community things.
Yes, it was. It was created like a small community, their own. I mean, it looked like what a home makes for them here in the UK. So it looked like we are a community, me and them. They had somebody to go and talk freely without being scared that police are going to take them or their families are going to find out. And yeah, it was a nice thing, but the most important thing was the trust. And what message I would send out to organizations which works with sex workers, it's just listen to them and acknowledge that they are people, that they know what they are talking about, and yeah, give them a voice to.
And for me, it was a good learning to be able to see this complexity between sex work and trafficking, and to understand that although it's not trafficking, they have a lot of challenges, issues, things that we need to help them.
Yes.
And I think for me it was a good learning to stay together with you. And I want to thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for this honor to be part of this conference. And what I want to say in the end, it's now I'm working in a school and I try to educate these young girls and to help them to make the difference between being called a sex worker when you are under the age and the difference between child sexual exploitation and sex work. And again, about the Roma community, which I want to educate them and make them understand, you know, to make good choices in their life. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nour and Diana. We have already questions if you would like to see in the chat and think about them. And now we'll go to the second presentation that we have, a socio-legal analysis of reforms in the regulation of sex work, the case study of on-demand legislation in Israel. We have with us Dr. Inga Thiemann from the University of Exeter and Professor Hila Shamir from Tel Aviv University. The floor is yours.
Okay, I'm not going to do long introductions because I think we've been a bit over ambitious in how much we're trying to cover in 20 minutes. So I'm just going to dive right into it. And just give me a second. Why is it not letting me present? No, it's not what I want. There we go. Okay. So Guy has already introduced our title. So it's a social-legal analysis of reforms in the regulation of sex work. And we looked at Israel as a case study. So I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about our methodology. So we developed a new analytical framework to describe and assess legal changes in the regulation of sex work. And we used a variety of methods for the Israeli case study, but one I want to emphasize is that we did 6 semi-structured interviews with activist sex workers from the organization Agaman. And I did these interviews while I was visiting the TrafLab project in summer 2019. So just after the on-demand legislation had passed, but before it had been enacted. And I had great plans of returning and doing interviews with the same people again in 2020, but obviously that didn't happen. But still they give us a good indication of the kinds of concerns sex workers and sex workers' rights activists had at the time about what was going to happen once the legislation was implemented. So our analytical framework basically has a focus on the law in action. So we're not looking at the legislation in terms of what is the law in the statute, how is it written, what is it trying to achieve, but what is the actual impact of the legislation on the lives of those it seeks to affect. And does it create the change it claims it wants to create? And are there side effects of the legislation? And maybe effects that are not intended by the legislators or the groups that lobbied for it? So we focus on this change, but we also think something else is important. And we talk about it in terms of baseline. So we look at what kind of regulatory history a country comes from when entering into new regulatory regimes on sex work. So because the starting point matters. Depending on where your starting point is, the same policy can be liberating or it can be restricting for sex workers. So taking in-demand legislation from a starting point of full criminalization, as we have, for example, in the US, in-demand can be viewed as a less repressive option because it decriminalizes sex workers. However, if you have a starting point of partial criminalization and relatively permissive implementation, which is what the Israeli example was before the implementation of in-demand legislation, in-demand legislation ends up being more repressive for sex workers. So our analytical framework is based on a typology of sex work introduced by Petra Östergren, in which she basically creates 3 categories, and she calls them repressive, restrictive, and integrative. And we have expanded on her category by adding a 4th column, which we call permissive. And we use this terminology throughout, which is why I'm going to take a minute to explain it a little bit. So in Petra's original typology, she makes an effort to move beyond the notion of criminal law, of what is the law on sex work, but she looks at the intent of the policy. And as I said, we're looking at the law in action. So we're trying to look at both the intent, but also what it actually does. And so we use these 4 categories to illustrate shifts in legislation and also intentions and shifts of legislation. And we're going to illustrate this with the Israeli example in a second. So having those 4 types helps us to separate the goals of the legislation and the lived realities in the sex industry under such regulation. So in the Israeli example, the law on the books was restrictive. So in one of the 2 middle categories, up until 2018. But the implementation was quite permissive. So we had a sort of more relaxed reality than we had in the legislation on the books. However, there were already movements happening prior to 2018, and Hila is going to talk about this in much more detail, that shifted to a more restrictive through anti-trafficking policies, and then also through pushes by proponents of the Nordic model. And then the shift to in-demand legislation in 2018 would indicate a move to a repressive approach if we see it from the baseline of previous legislation. And whether that will actually translate into a fully repressive or more likely restrictive policy in action is yet to be seen. We're going to talk a little bit about that later. So we're experiencing a shift from restrictive, but with a permissive implementation, to repressive with a possibly restrictive implementation, which is yet to be seen. But I'm going to hand over to Hila now, and she's going to talk about how we got here.
Thank you, Inga. So in my part of the talk today, I'll use the socio-legal framework Inga just presented to address the process that led to the Israeli in-demand legislation and its eventual impact on sex workers. And the discussion will be chronological. I'll first describe and analyze the legal baseline in Israel before the anti-trafficking campaign, then the impactful anti-trafficking campaign that focused on non-citizens and the way it transformed the sex industry. And finally, to introduce the steps anti-prostitution feminists took regarding Israelis in the sex industry, culminating in the 2018 in-demand legislation and its aftermath and enforcement. So let's begin with pre-2000. And Inga, you can move the slide. So until 2018, yeah, thanks. Until 2018, Israeli law partially criminalized sex work. The penal code criminalized pimping, holding or renting out a site for prostitution, and living off the profits of a prostitute. And since 2001, it also criminalized trafficking in persons for the purpose of prostitution. So the law on the books was restrictive. Prostitution was seen as a negative social phenomenon, but persons engaged in prostitution were seen as its victims. All aspects of prostitution were criminalized except for the act itself. Neither the sex worker nor the client were criminalized. And we identified the Israeli situation as merely restrictive because independent sex workers could theoretically work without breaking any laws, although there was legislative and judicial history that suggests that there was a regulatory goal of guaranteeing a stricter restriction, but due to the short time, I won't go into that. So despite this formally restrictive policy on the books, the law in action pulled the Israeli system towards a de facto permissive regulatory style. So from the mid-1990s, there was a policy of tolerance, we can call it, in different regulatory, executive, and enforcement agencies. Several authorities took an uncoordinated approach towards toleration and even partial regulation of sex work. So police were instructed not to investigate prostitution offenses unless there were aggravating circumstances. And this, of course, resulted in de facto creation of a zone of toleration of prostitution and a non-enforcement regarding offenses related to prostitution if there were no aggravating circumstances. Other institutions and state officials further expressed a permissive approach to prostitution. So the National Insurance Institute recognized a physical harm caused to a sex worker due to brothel fire as a work-related injury. Tax authorities collected income tax from brothel owners, very controversial for sex workers themselves. The labor courts granted full employment rights to trafficked individuals who sued their pimps and traffickers, even while indicating non-recognition of their contracts as employment contracts. Finally, the High Court of Justice and trial courts awarded compensation for torts claims for the cost of payment of sexual services to disabled individuals. This was overturned later. The overall impact was a permissive approach to sex work and regulation of the sex industry in ways that could promote protection of sex workers' rights. They could claim their rights in national insurance, in labor courts, with the police. The series of decisions affected a de facto change in Israel from a restrictive to a hybrid approach, which included a restrictive approach on the books, but a permissive policy style in action. Now, this was a complicated position. Anti-prostitution feminists argued against this hybridity and pushed towards enhancing enforcement. They viewed this hybridity as a form of hypocrisy. The state fails to protect women from violence by insufficiently restricting prostitution. But the hybrid approach was similarly problematic from a pro-decriminalization feminist standpoint because it symbolically marginalizes sex work and prevents them from being fully socially and economically integrated. So the hybrid approach sends two messages: restriction of prostitution at the symbolic level and permission, partial normalization in practice. As a result of its informal and dialectic nature, it really left wide discretion to low-level bureaucrats. And the hybrid approach was therefore dynamic and unstable. In 2018, it was transformed on the books when Israel adopted repressive and demand legislation. But even decades before its enactment, the reinforcement of more repressive elements in the system aimed to combat human trafficking swung the policy pendulum towards a more restrictive direction. So Inga, we can move to the post-2000. So the hybrid approach to the regulation of sex work began to change following growing awareness of the severe exploitation and violence that migrant sex workers and trafficking victims, mostly in the Israeli case, women from the former Soviet Union, experienced in the Israeli sex industry in the early 2000s. The growing number of non-citizen women who entered the Israeli sex industry and the involvement of international organized crime networks, coupled with a reinvigorated international and especially US interest in the renewed definition of human trafficking, caused the Israeli government to pay attention to the phenomenon. So seizing this opportunity, anti-prostitution feminists joining others concerned with human trafficking, joining others, wait, let's mute and wait. Workers, so kind of seizing this opportunity, anti-prostitution feminists and others who wanted to work on issues of migrant workers exploitation began to pressure the government to change its policies and close the gap between the law in the books and the law in action. And Israeli feminist concerns about victims of trafficking began to be heard already in the late 1990s, but especially since 2000, following the enactment of the US Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act, the TVPA, to which American anti-prostitution feminists contributed significantly, and we see here a network of feminists working on this. So Israel was first put on the lowest tier, the third tier, putting Israel at risk of economic sanctions in the form of US withdrawal of aid. And the US understanding of trafficking and its focus on trafficking into the sex industry directly affected Israeli policy making on the matter. The Israeli response to trafficking in persons came that same year already, when Israel was put at a low rank, a low tier, in the form of an amendment to the penal code criminalizing trafficking. The section was then replaced in 2006 by a more capacious law, with the increased political focus on trafficking into the sex industry and sex workers' migration into Israel. Anti-prostitution feminists gained increasing access to governance and engaged in an effective campaign to increase enforcement against sex trafficking and prostitution and guarantee better treatment and services for survivors and victims. From their perspective, it was a tale of remarkable success. Due to their intense activities, brothel raids, prosecution of traffickers, penalties increased significantly. Because of the already repressive law in the books, much of the policy change occurred without additional legislation, through only a change in priorities instigated through the Knesset, the Israeli Parliament, Subcommittee on Trafficking in Women. Further changes in the penal code did occur in 2011. They prohibited the advertisement of sexual services with increasing penalties and online enforcement through a new cyber unit, which from 2013 made it almost impossible for the sex industry and particularly for individual sex workers to publicize their services and especially to vet clients in advance. In addition to increased enforcement, anti-prostitution feminists lobbied for intensified border control. More non-Israeli women were removed from Israel upon their rescue from brothels, and due to enhanced border restrictions, fewer non-Israeli women entered the Israeli sex industry. Simultaneously, there was a marked improvement in the treatment of the small number of identified victims of trafficking, and the numbers were very small, who received visa, shelter, healthcare, and emotional support, job training, language skills, and legal aid. Most of them were deported. By 2008, it was widely agreed by Israeli police, relevant government ministries, and involved NGOs that transnational trafficking into the Israeli sex industry in the form we have seen until then has been more or less curtailed. Gradually, the protective response towards migrant sex workers translated into greater attention to and a repressive approach towards the sex industry as a whole, impacting Israeli workers as well. And this echoed similar occurrences in other countries. Israeli anti-prostitution feminists then shifted their focus from trafficking only to the issue of all prostitution and began lobbying for the adoption of a Swedish style and demand bill, which was something they wanted earlier on, but now had more ability to pursue. Now, it's worth noting that sex workers' voices were not part of this new coalition that formed to put forward and demand. Until the new sex workers organization Argaman was established in 2018, the few attempts to establish sex workers organization failed, and in parliamentary committees and other policy forums, women in prostitution were heard mostly as victims, as rescued survivors who share their difficult life stories, the violent realities of prostitution they endured, but not in any way as agents in their own right or experts in this field. So the anti-prostitution governance feminist position didn't aim solely to entrench the criminality of prostitution. It also sought to accompany alternatives and assistance for women. So in the last decade, the otherwise shrinking Israeli welfare state really expanded rehabilitative services for women in prostitution. While still insufficient, funds were secured and new services were created by the state and different municipalities, and a growing civil society community engaged in this. Now, due to the effective lobbying of anti-prostitution feminists, the law in action shifted from permissive to restrictive, adhering more closely to its declared restrictive goal and gradually closing the opening for a tolerated, unofficially permitted above-the-ground sex industry. And I'll say a couple of things about the last stage, which is 2018. So in 2018, as you all know, Israel passed end-demand legislation. The first bill was put forward in 2008. And then, as you can see in the slide, again and again and again until it passed in 2018. It took a decade of intensive lobbying and several iterations of the bill to build sufficient support. An in-depth interministerial report that heard experts and their other stakeholders, but not sex workers, along with the welfare ministry and national survey about the Israeli sex industry, resulted in a call for a holistic approach, not based exclusively on criminal enforcement. In July 2018, in response to the increased enforcement and police harassment of sex workers, and in attempt to resist further restrictions and repressions of the industry, sex workers established the rights organization, Argaman. And Argaman's first priority was to resist the introduction of on-demand legislation and to make their members' voices heard and their interests considered in policy processes. They thought this will increase violence and actually open them to become more vulnerable. However, their ability to influence the policy process was limited. The workers described the legislation process as taking place over their heads. And as Yela Lavra has also showed in our research, they said that there was no genuine concern to their voices. So in 2018, a group of sex workers from Argaman, and I think we have another slide for this if you want to put it on, Inga, stood protesting with red umbrellas outside the Knesset. The on-demand law was enacted. The law criminalized procurement of sexual services, imposing an administrative fine on offenders with an alternative option to attend a John school. The law stipulated that it would come into force 18 months following its legislation in July 2020 and would remain in place for 5 years, during which its impact would be studied and assessed prior to its extension. You can see here, those who read the Hebrew, that Section 1 declares the law's purpose as reducing prostitution, as well as expanding public education about the harms of prostitution and expanding treatment and rehabilitation to persons in prostitution. The law itself does not...
2 minutes.
Okay, so let me just actually just say that just say one more thing and move it quickly for Inga to close. That while the law itself does not include provisions regarding rehabilitation, there was a governmental decision to adopt the big 2017 report and establish treatment and rehabilitation programs. Argaman tried to resist the act. It just came into effect when COVID hit. And for a while there, they managed to push it off, but eventually it came into force after some ministerial resistance. And I'm passing it on to Inga.
Okay, I'm going to skip most of my conclusions, but I do want to highlight some of the voices of sex workers themselves. So I, in my interviews in 2019, asked them what their concerns were about the legislation, which at that point had not yet been enacted. And I'm just going to read out some quotes. In general, people will be afraid. I don't think they're going to be scared in the apartments just yet, but in the brothels, in the places where the girls can't be independent, they will be afraid. For women migrant workers, it is even more horrible. It can only make sex workers' lives harder, more complicated, and they have much less power in the negotiation with the clients because the clients now have taken a risk. He's already taking a risk, so he's going to expect something to make it easier for him, like a lower price or whatever. And with regard as to who is going to be affected by the law, I have a feeling if it's going to be enforced at all, they are going to be completely not enforced on male workers. Nobody seems to care at all. For male sex workers, if you look at the public view about it, what I hear about it anyway, is that nobody thinks male sex workers are victims of anything. I go to some fetish parties, BDSM parties, and people get to know me this way. I'm lucky that I deal with a special area that is not the classical prostitution, and so I don't really get much of the fire personally. It's not that I don't see myself as part of the sex industry, of course I do. So we have very different views depending on where people situated themselves within the sex industry, but also whether they were women and therefore fitted the category of who was going to be rescued by the Nordic model, by on-demand legislation, or if they were, in one case, a male sex worker who felt like he was completely outside the scope So he wasn't particularly worried, but also he thought it was really interesting that there was this very different approach to whether or not somebody was a male or a female sex worker. A common theme I experienced in my interviews was that the people I talked to felt they were relatively secure. Often they had other income to rely on, or had savings, so they felt like they would be safe, but they were really worried about other workers, especially street-based sex workers and trans sex workers, and migrant sex workers. So there was a shared theme of those who are already the most vulnerable will be most negatively affected by the legislation. And people gave anecdotal evidence from colleagues who were working extra shifts, were putting themselves at risks of contracting STIs, of experiencing severe exhaustion because people were trying to work incredible amounts of shifts in order to accumulate some savings prior to the legislative change. And they had good reason to—
Inga, we have to come to an end.
Yes, okay. I will just not share my final slides, but basically the concerns of the people I talked to were mostly justified because vulnerable and highly visible sex workers were the ones who got the majority of policy attention in the first phase that we're currently experiencing post-implementation of the legislation. Okay, I'm gonna end it here.
Thank you very much, both Inga and Hila and Diana and Nour. And we have several questions. We'll start with Diana and Nour. Shmuel Yerushalmi asked if you know something about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the war of Russia and Ukraine on human trafficking processes in the sex industry. I believe that you know, maybe you can say something about what happened in Romania or in the UK in this era.
They were guys at the border offering.
Yeah, okay. So Shmuel, first, thank you for the question. And I will say something in general about that, and then Diana will say some things about she knows about what happened in Romania, and especially the border between
the border, yeah.
So in general, I want to say, and I think Professor Hila Shamir wrote a beautiful paper about and the ideas of how human trafficking and sex work are something that it's not from A to B. It can be. It's very diverse. It can be maybe start in sex work, then go to coercion, to trafficking, and maybe the opposite can happen. So there's many things that can happen in this journey, and I think it's too early to say, and we need, especially for what happening in Ukraine, and we need more research to understand the journey that those women are have experienced, to understand what happened to them and what will happen with them in the future. So, Diana?
So they were cases. They were also on social media, on the Romanian television and around Europe. And they were traffickers waiting at the border with Ukraine for these Ukrainian ladies coming over the border, crossing the border, offering accommodation and jobs, and actually they were coercing them into sex work, because they were all pretty young ladies, and so yeah, some of them fell into this, but not all of them. Yeah. But they were cases. So yes, it was they were affected. And I'm not saying they were already sex workers, but they were.
And I just want to say something like about what you said. It's a media, and I think one of the things that the government should invest money to investigate it and to look at it in a really serious way, and not only leave it to be in a media and creating like a panic.
Yeah.
So it's and I think it's also one of the things that we are suffering from this black and white sex work and trafficking, and there is not so serious research.
And there is no accuracy in that, because it was not counted. It was not so we are not sure, but they were cases, because they were women ending up in the police station and saying, look, we were put in this house and we were asked to go with men. And
thank you very much. Hila and Inga, I asked a question here. I thought that you said, I'm not sure if you said it, but what I understood was that you're saying that in the permissive phase where Israel was in the 90s and beginning of the 2000s, the situation was better. And I thought maybe if you have any examples of the better situation, not only in terms of the law, but what happened in the field. For example, did sex workers approached the police for help? Or were there any, do we know if it was safe to be a sex worker compared to what we see now?
So there's relatively little research about that period that is based on interviews with sex workers, but I have two clues to this. One is just looking through Freedom of Information requests about the number of prosecutions or offenses or fines given to women in the area of for example, the Israeli Central Bus Station in Tel Aviv, where we see a huge increase over time with minor offenses like a nuisance to the public and crossing the street in the wrong place or smoking in an area you're not supposed to smoke in. And we see a huge increase in the number of fines provided, of prosecutions, and so forth. So in terms of, we do see examples of the tension between police and sex workers through that. Otherwise, I only have anecdotal information about this from conversations with sex workers, older sex workers who were there in the 90s and were there in the early 2000s, and some of them are to some extent even now, who do say that they used to turn to police, that police protected them, that there weren't bouncers, for example, at the entrance of brothels so much because they knew the police would come. They didn't need as many protective protections in the discrete apartments, and they see the rise in bouncers and guards in the discrete apartments in their own needs for cameras as an example of the fact that they felt less secure and felt like there's nobody else to protect them. So again, this is anecdotal, but this is the information that I have, and I think, you know, for me, it does signify that this change impacted sex workers' safety and feeling of ability to turn to the authorities. I will also say that since then, there are no more claims to the labor court, since we see intensification of enforcement, which again shows a new realignment of Israeli civil society around these issues, and also sex workers' own disengagement with the state.
Thank you, and maybe two short questions to both of to each of you. Diana, do you know something about, or are there any male sex workers from Romania coming to UK?
Yes, they are. I had 3 clients. They were they were males coming to work in the UK, but they usually attended parties with older ladies. So that was what they were doing. And another category is young Roma boys, which you would never expect. And this was not only in the UK, it was all around Europe. It was a research done by Professor Nick Mai from Italy. He is in UK. It was a research about that. And they were young Roma boys being sex workers, but it was male having sex with males, this kind of. So
Thank
because
you.
they made good monies and they were young boys, they had families back in Romania, and this is how they supported. Some of them were under the age of 18.
Thank you very much. And the last question, it's from Shmuel Yerushalmi to Inga. I think that what Shmuel is asking, what do you think personally about the on-demand legislation? Or do you think there is a better way in order to struggle against the negative consequences of prostitution?
Well, so I don't have a moral opinion about it. I just have the evidence from a lot of research from countries that have already implemented it, that even though it tries to criminalize the buyers of sexual services, the criminal burden ends up lying with the women. So from Sweden, we have examples of landlords being told that their tenant is a sex worker, and if they don't kick out that tenant, they will be charged with pimping charges. Or women are told their children who are over the age of 18, who live in the same household because they benefit from the income of prostitution, they're suddenly charged with pimping, even though they're just living with their mothers, right? So there are lots of ways in which women end up being the ones affected by the policy. And I think that is not the intent of people who are proposing on-demand legislation. And I think better approaches to reduce prostitution have to think much more big picture. So we have to think about potentially things like universal basic income, things like social security increase for mothers, because the majority of women in sex work are mothers. So we have to think much more about decreasing gendered poverty in order to make sure that there are fewer women in sex work for whom sex work is one out of a number of not so great possible choices. And then also if what remains is essentially mostly people who actively choose sex work out of a set of options, that will probably have fewer problems because the majority of issues we find at the intersections of sex work and poverty, but also it will mean it'll be a more true choice to the degree that anyone within a capitalist system that isn't independently wealthy chooses anything.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for very interesting presentations and a very interesting session. We'll go to